It was just after midnight on June 24, 1943. The quiet, cobblestone streets of Bamber Bridge, a sleepy village in Lancashire, England, should have been silent. The war was raging across the Channel in Europe, but here, deep in the British countryside, the only sound should have been the distant hum of bombers or the clatter of a late train. Instead, the night air was shattered by the terrifying, distinctive crack of American Springfield rifles and the roar of Jeep engines. Bullets chewed into the brick facades of banks and shops. Glass shattered onto the pavement. Men screamed orders in American accents, diving for cover behind stone walls and hedgerows. To a confused observer waking up in terror, it looked like a German invasion. Had the Nazis finally landed? Had paratroopers dropped into the Midlands? But if you looked closer, through the smoke and the rain, you would see something that defied all logic. The men shooting were wearing American uniforms. The men they were shooting at were also wearing American uniforms. It was a firefight between soldiers of the same army, fighting for the same flag, in the middle of an Allied country. On one side were the men of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment. They were black. They were the drivers who moved the supplies that kept the war machine running. They were armed with rifles, bayonets, and a righteous, boiling fury that had been building for months. On the other side were the military police of the 234th MP Company. They were white. They were armed with submachine guns and the absolute authority of the Jim Crow South, exported 3,000 miles across the ocean. This was not a riot. This was a battle. It was the moment when the United States Army went to war with itself. It was the night when a group of black soldiers, pushed beyond the breaking point by the racism of their own commanders, decided that if they were going to die for freedom, they might as well start by fighting for their own. They said these men were undisciplined. They said they were cowards. But that night, the 1511th fought with a tactical precision and a desperate courage that terrified the white MPs who had come to teach them a lesson. To understand how a quaint English village became a battlefield for the American civil rights movement 2 decades before it officially began, you have to understand the bizarre, twisted reality of 1943. When the United States entered World War II, it brought with it 2 things: immense industrial power and immense racial hatred. The U.S. military was rigidly segregated. Black soldiers served in all-black units, commanded mostly by white officers, many of whom were Southerners who viewed their troops with contempt. When these troops arrived in Britain to prepare for the invasion of Europe, the U.S. military leadership was terrified. They were not afraid of the Germans. They were afraid of the British. You see, Britain in the 1940s was not a racial utopia, but it was virtually devoid of the institutionalized segregation that defined American life. There were no colored water fountains. There were no whites-only sections on the buses. When the black GIs arrived, expecting to be treated like pariahs, they were shocked to find themselves treated like heroes. The British people, weary from years of bombing and rationing, welcomed the Americans with open arms. And they made no distinction based on skin color. In fact, many British locals preferred the black GIs. They found them to be polite, generous with their rations of chocolate and cigarettes, and respectful of local customs. The white GIs, by contrast, were often seen as arrogant, loud, and overpaid, oversexed, and over here. This cultural embrace drove the American high command insane. White American officers would walk into a British pub and see a black soldier buying a pint for a white local. They would see black soldiers dancing with white British women at village halls. To a white officer raised in Alabama or Georgia, this was not just a breach of protocol, it was a violation of the natural order. It was a nightmare come to life. General Ira Aker, commanding the US 8th Air Force, actually tried to convince the British government to institute segregation laws similar to those in the US. He wanted the British to ban black soldiers from pubs, cinemas, and shops. The British government politely, but firmly, told him to go to hell. A memo from the British cabinet stated clearly, "It is not the policy of His Majesty's government to legislate on the basis of race." So, the US Army tried to enforce Jim Crow unofficially. They instituted color bars in towns. They designated certain pubs as white and others as black. They used the military police, the MPs, as the enforcers of racial purity. The MPs would patrol the streets, looking for any excuse to harass, beat, or arrest black soldiers who stepped out of line. If a black soldier was seen talking to a white woman, he was arrested for disorderly conduct. If he had a button unbuttoned on his tunic, he was beaten with a nightstick. It was a campaign of terror, designed to remind the black troops that even in England, they were still in the South. But Bamber Bridge was different. The 1511th Quartermaster Regiment had been stationed there for months. They had become part of the fabric of the village. They drank at the local pubs, the Ye Olde Hobbin, the Black Horse. They dated local girls. They played with the local children. The people of Bamber Bridge loved them. And when the white MPs from nearby bases would come into town to harass their soldiers, the locals did not stand by. There are stories of British pub landlords kicking white MPs out of their bars for being rude to black customers. There are stories of old English ladies hitting MPs with their handbags for trying to arrest black soldiers. The 1511th knew they had allies. They felt safe in Bamber Bridge. They felt human. And that was the problem. The MPs could not stand it. They saw the confidence of the black truckers. They saw them walking with their heads high, laughing with white civilians, forgetting their place. The pressure was building like steam in a boiler. The white officers at the nearby headquarters were looking for an excuse to crack down. They wanted to break the spirit of the 1511th. They wanted to show them who was boss. On the night of June 24th, they found their excuse. It started, as so many wars do, with something incredibly small. A glass of beer. A uniform violation. A word spoken in anger. But underneath the petty details lay a volcano of resentment that was about to erupt. The MPs drove their jeeps into Bamber Bridge that night looking for a fight. They were aggressive. They were heavily armed. And they were drunk on power. They pulled up to Ye Olde Hobbin, the favourite watering hole of the black troops. They swung their batons. They demanded passes. They looked for trouble. But they forgot one thing. The men of the 1511th were not new recruits. They were veterans of the logistics war. They had driven trucks through air raids. They were tough. And they were tired of being treated like criminals by the men who were supposed to be on their side. When the MPs tried to arrest a soldier named Private Eugene Nunn for not wearing the correct uniform, the pub went silent. The British locals put down their glasses. The black soldiers stood up. A British ATS woman, a soldier herself, stood between the MP and the black private and shouted, "Leave him alone. He is doing no harm." It was a moment of absolute clarity. The lines were drawn. On one side, the racist authority of the US Army. On the other side, the black soldiers and the white British civilians standing united. The MPs, humiliated by the British woman's intervention, backed down for a moment. But they did not leave. They retreated to their jeeps, radios crackling, calling for reinforcements. They were not going to let this go. They were coming back. And they were bringing guns. Back at the barracks of the 1511th, the rumour mill was spinning out of control. The MPs are killing our guys. They re-coming to shoot up the pub. They re-bringing a convoy. The men of the 1511th looked at each other. They looked at the rifles locked in the racks. They looked at the machine guns mounted on their trucks. They realized that there was no one coming to save them. The police were the enemy. The officers were the enemy. If they wanted to survive the night, they would have to defend themselves. And so, in a small town in England, thousands of miles from the front lines, a mutiny began. But they did not call it a mutiny. They called it self-defense. They smashed the locks on the army. They loaded their Springfield rifles. They grabbed bandoliers of ammunition. If they want a war, one soldier said, chambering around, let us give them a war. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was about to begin. And the US Army was about to learn a very hard lesson. You can only push a man so far before he pushes back. Before we dive into the chaos of the battle, I want to know where you stand. If you were a soldier in a foreign land, and the police from your own army started attacking you, would you surrender? or would you fight back? Drop a comment below. Let us get the discussion started. To truly comprehend why American soldiers were loading rifles to kill their own countrymen on English soil, you have to look beyond the uniforms and into the jealousy that was rotting the morale of the US Army from the inside out. The catalyst for the Battle of Bamber Bridge was not just military discipline. It was not just about unbuttoned tunics or missing passes. It was about something far more primal, something that terrified the white supremacists in the officer corps more than any German panzer division. It was the way black men were being treated by British women. In the United States, in 1943, a black man looking at a white woman the wrong way could be, and often was, lynched. It was the ultimate taboo, the cornerstone of the racial hierarchy. But in Lancashire, that hierarchy did not exist. Black GIs were dating local girls. They were invited to Sunday dinners. They were seen walking hand in hand through the village greens. For the white American MPs patrolling these towns, this was not just fraternization, it was a personal insult. It shattered their worldview. They saw British women treating men they considered subhuman with affection and respect, and it drove them into a murderous rage. The black troops of the 1511th Quartermaster Regiment were popular. They were well paid compared to the British Tommies, they were generous with their supplies, and they were polite. The locals called them tan Yanks. There's a famous story from the time of a British publican who was asked by white American officers to segregate his bar. He agreed. The next day, he put up signs. One said black troops only. The other said white troops. But he put the black troops only sign on the door to the warm, cozy lounge bar with the dartboard and the fireplace. He put the white troops sign on the door to the cold, wet stable yard out back. This was the atmosphere in June 1943. The white MPs were an occupying force not just against the British, but against their own black comrades. They were looking for a reason to reassert dominance. They wanted to humiliate the black soldiers in front of their British friends. They wanted to prove that no matter how far they travelled, Jim Crow was still the law of the land. So, let us go back to ye olde Hobbin. It is closing time. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of ale. Private Eugene Nunn is having a drink. He is wearing a field jacket, which is technically against regulations for a night out. You are supposed to be in Class A uniform. It was a minor infraction, the kind of thing a decent MP would ignore or issue a warning for. But the MPs who walked into the bar that night, Corporal Roy A. Windsor and Private First Class Ralph A. Ridgway, were not decent. They were hunters. They spotted none. They did not see a soldier blowing off steam. They saw a target. They approached him aggressively, batons in hand. They demanded his pass. They criticized his uniform. They tried to arrest him on the spot. But they miscalculated the room. The British civilians did not back away. They stood up. British soldiers from the Royal Air Force and the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, surrounded the MPs. Why do not you leave them alone? One British woman shouted. They re-fighting the same war you are. The MPs were outnumbered, not by the black soldiers, but by their white allies. Humiliated, Windsor and Ridgway retreated. But as they walked out the door, the tension snapped. A beer bottle went flying. It struck the windshield of their Jeep, shattering the glass. The MPs drove off, but they did not go back to headquarters to file a report. They went to get reinforcements. They went to get guns. Meanwhile, the black soldiers at the pub decided it was time to leave. They were not looking for a firefight. They just wanted to get back to their barracks at Adams Hall, about a mile away. They started walking. It was a dark, wet night. They were unarmed. They were laughing off the incident, thinking it was over. It was not. As the group of black soldiers, including Private Nunn and Private Lynn Adams, walked up the road toward their base, the sound of engines cut through the darkness. 3 jeeps roared around the corner. It was the MPs. And they had not come to talk. They had intercepted the group. The MPs jumped out, not with batons this time, but with sidearms drawn. They screamed at the black soldiers to line up. The situation escalated in seconds. Words were exchanged. A punch was thrown. And then, without warning, an MP leveled his .45 caliber pistol and fired. Private Lynn Adams grabbed his neck. He fell to the pavement, blood spurting through his fingers. He had been shot in the throat. Chaos erupted. The black soldiers, realizing they were being executed in the street, scattered. They ran for the hedgerows, diving into the wet grass as the MPs opened fire on the retreating men. It was an ambush. A cowardly, armed assault on unarmed men. The MPs chased them, firing into the darkness. The surviving black soldiers sprinted the rest of the way to Adams Hall. They burst into the barracks, breathless, covered in mud and blood. They were screaming the news that would turn the regiment into a revolutionary army. The MPs are killing us. They shot Adams. They coming to kill us all. Panic turned instantly into cold, hard resolve. You have to understand the mindset of these men. They were trained soldiers. They had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution. But in that moment, the Constitution was not protecting them. The police were the bad guys. If they stayed in their bunks, they believed they would be slaughtered. The NCOs, non-commissioned officers, tried to maintain order, but the rage was uncontrollable. Men ran to the supply room. The rifle racks were locked. They did not have keys. It did not matter. They grabbed fire axes. They grabbed crowbars. With the sound of splintering wood and tearing metal, the armory was breached. They pulled out M1903 Springfield rifles. They grabbed Thompson submachine guns. They opened crates of ammunition, tossing bandoliers to each other like they were on the front lines of Guadalcanal. They fixed bayonets. If they come through that gate, one soldier yelled, chambering around, they are not going home. But it was not just a mob. Some of the men were thinking tactically. They knew the MPs would come in vehicles. So they raided the motor pool. They took their own trucks, the Big Juice and a half supply trucks, and drove them to the main gates of the base. They parked them sideways, blocking the entrance, creating a barricade. They set up defensive positions behind the trucks, leveling their rifles at the road leading from the town. They turned their base into a fortress. Back in the town, the MPs were regrouping. They knew they had started something big. But instead of de-escalating, they doubled down. They called for an armored car. They called for a machine gun truck. They were treating this not as a police action, but as a suppression of an insurrection. They referred to the black soldiers with racial slurs over the radio. They were preparing for a turkey shoot. At the base, the white officers of the 1511th were waking up to a nightmare. Major Harris, the commander, tried to calm his men down. He managed, for a brief moment, to get some of them to put their weapons back. He told them he would handle it. He told them to trust him. And then, the MPs arrived. It was the single worst moment of judgment in the history of the US military police. Just as the black soldiers were beginning to stand down, putting their faith in their commander, a convoy of MP jeeps and an armored car equipped with a heavy machine gun rolled up to the gate. They did not ask questions. They did not ask for the commander. They saw black faces, and they opened fire. The heavy chatter of the machine gun tore through the night. Bullets ripped through the walls of the guard hut. They shredded the trees. They slammed into the barracks where men were trying to sleep. That was it. The truce was dead. The black soldiers who had put their rifles down picked them back up. They poured out of the barracks, not as a disorderly mob, but as a fighting force. They returned fire. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was on. It was surreal. Tracers zipped through the English countryside. The peaceful village woke up to the sound of full-scale urban combat. Black soldiers flanked the MP convoy, using the tactics they had learned in basic training. They laid down suppressing fire. They moved from cover to cover. They were fighting for their lives against their own countrymen. The MPs, expecting a terrified rabble, found themselves pinned down by disciplined rifle fire. They were taking hits. They were forced to retreat from the gate, backing their vehicles up under a hail of lead. But the black soldiers did not stop at the gate. They realized that staying on the base made them sitting ducks for the armored car. They needed to spread out. They needed to take the fight to the enemy. "To the trucks!" someone shouted. Groups of black soldiers piled into jeeps and trucks. Others set out on foot. They broke out of the base and fanned out into the town of Bamber Bridge. They set up ambushes at intersections. They took sniper positions on rooftops. They turned the village into a guerrilla war zone. Imagine the scene: an English shopkeeper looking out his window to see a black American soldier prone in his garden, firing a Springfield rifle at a US Army jeep speeding down the high street. It was madness. It was a breakdown of every norm and regulation. But for the men of the 1511th, it was the only rational choice. They had been pushed, prodded, beaten, and now shot at. They had realized that the uniform they wore offered them no protection from the racism of their superiors. In fact, the uniform made them targets. So they decided to strip the authority from the MPs the only way they knew how: by force. For the next 4 hours, the streets of Bamber Bridge belonged to the mutineers. They hunted the MPs. They controlled the crossroads. They declared martial law in the name of dignity. But they knew, deep down, that this could not last. The sun would come up. The full weight of the US Army would descend on them. They were not fighting to win a war. They were fighting to make a point. They were fighting to say, "We are men, and you will not shoot us like dogs." As the clock ticked toward 3 o'clock a.m., the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold realization of what they had done. They had committed mutiny in wartime. The penalty was death. But as they looked at the bullet holes in their own barracks, fired by the police force meant to protect them, many of them felt a grim satisfaction. They had stood up. But the Empire was about to strike back. The white officers were organizing a massive response. They were not just bringing MPs now, they were bringing combat units. The sun was about to rise on a reckoning that would try to bury the truth of what happened in Bamber Bridge for 40 years. The shooting was stopping, but the cover-up was just beginning. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was not a riot. It was a military engagement. To describe it as anything less is to strip the men of the 1511th Quartermaster Regiment of their agency and their training. As the clock struck 1 o'clock a.m., the village of Bamber Bridge had been transformed into a surreal theatre of war. The geography of the town became a tactical map. The Bank of London became a sniper's nest. The quaint brick hedgerows of the local gardens became defensive berms. The black soldiers, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline, rage, and the terrifying certainty that they were fighting for their lives, moved with a discipline that shocked the military police. They did not run screaming into the night. They broke into fire teams. They utilized cover and concealment. They set up fields of fire. The MPs, who had rolled into town expecting to bully a few drunk truck drivers, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered. The hunters had become the hunted. A jeep would speed down Station Road, its headlights cutting through the drizzle, only to be met by a withering volley of rifle fire from the shadows of a pub doorway. The windshield shattered. Tires were blown out. The white MPs scrambled from their vehicles, diving into ditches, screaming into their radios for help that was miles away. For a few terrifying hours, the authority of the United States Army had completely collapsed in this corner of England. The badge meant nothing. The rank meant nothing. The only law was the Springfield rifle. But amidst the tactical maneuvering, there was chaos. The night was pitch black, illuminated only by the erratic flashes of gunfire and the sweeping beams of vehicle headlights. Confusion reigned. In the fog of this civil war, tragedy was inevitable. Private William Crossland was 34 years old. He was not a hothead. He was not looking for a fight. He was a truck driver who had signed up to do a job. In the chaos of the breakout, he had joined the others, caught up in the collective wave of panic and defense. He found himself in the maze of streets, separated from his unit. As the sound of gunfire echoed off the stone walls, Crossland was struck. A bullet tore through his body. He fell onto the wet English pavement, thousands of miles from his home in the United States. He did not die facing the Wehrmacht. He did not die storming a beach in Normandy. He died on the cobblestones of a friendly village, killed by a bullet fired by a member of his own army. His death changed the tenor of the night. When word rippled through the scattered groups of black soldiers that they got Crossland, the mood shifted from defensive to vengeful. The firing intensified. Soldiers aimed not just to suppress, but to kill. They shot out the searchlights the MPs were using to sweep the fields. They targeted the engines of the armored cars. And watching all of this, peering through drawn curtains and cracking open doors, were the people of Bamber Bridge. Their reaction is perhaps the most extraordinary part of this story. In a typical American race riot of the 1940s, in Detroit, or Harlem, or Beaumont, the white civilian population would have joined forces with the police to attack the black insurgents. But this was England. The locals did not see insurgents. They saw their friends. They saw the polite young men who gave them candy bars and danced with their daughters being hunted down like animals. The British civilians opened their doors, not to the MPs, but to the mutineers. There are accounts of local families ushering fleeing black soldiers into their living rooms, hiding them in cellars, offering them cups of tea while the MPs prowled outside. One British woman famously shouted at an MP patrol from her window, calling them Yankee bastards and telling them to go back to America if they wanted to act like thugs. The color bar that the US Army had tried so hard to enforce had failed completely. When the bullets started flying, the British chose sides, and they chose the black GIs. By 3:00 a.m., the situation was stabilizing into a stalemate. The MPs had established a perimeter around the town, but they were afraid to go back in. The black soldiers held the center. But the adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the cold, damp reality of the English morning. The men of the 1511th began to realize the magnitude of what had happened. They looked at their rifles, hot to the touch. They looked at the empty shell casings littering the streets. They looked at the body of Private Crossland. They knew the consequences. Mutiny in wartime is a capital offense. The penalty is death by firing squad. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. Some of them threw their weapons into the hedges, hoping to claim they were never armed. Others returned to the base, walking back through the shattered gates with their hands up, exhausted and resigned. A few, terrified of the retribution they knew was coming, fled into the countryside, hiding in barns and haylofts, sparking a manhunt that would last for days. When the sun finally rose on June 25th, Bamber Bridge looked like a war zone. The windows of Ye Olde Hob Inn were smashed. The brick walls of the bank were pockmarked with bullet holes, scars that are still visible today if you know where to look. Abandoned jeeps sat in the road, tires flat, engine smoking. The streets were littered with debris, but the silence was heavier than the gunfire. The US Army moved in with overwhelming force. It was not just MPs anymore. Senior officers arrived in staff cars. Regular infantry units were brought in to secure the area. They disarmed the 1511th. They placed the entire regiment under arrest. The base at Adams Hall was locked down, turned into a temporary prison camp. The white officers were furious, but they were also terrified. They realized that this event was a public relations catastrophe. They were preparing for D-Day. The invasion of Europe was months away, and here they were, fighting a race war in the backyard of their closest ally. The British press was asking questions. The War Department in Washington would be demanding answers. The immediate reaction of the Army command was predictable: blame the black soldiers. The narrative began to take shape before the smoke had even cleared. They were undisciplined. They were agitators. They were prone to panic. The role of the racist MPs, the instigation at the pub, the shooting of Private Adams, all of that was downplayed or ignored. The Army needed a villain, and a group of black men with guns fit the casting call perfectly. General Acre, the man who had wanted to segregate British pubs, was livid. He wanted heads to roll. He wanted a court-martial that would send a message to every black soldier in the European theatre: submit or die. 32 men were singled out. They were identified as the ringleaders. They were charged with mutiny, seizing arms, rioting, and attempted murder. They were stripped of their ranks, thrown into the stockade, and prepared for a show trial. But as the Army prepared its case, they encountered a problem: the witnesses. The British civilians of Bamber Bridge were not cooperating with the narrative. When army investigators interviewed the locals, expecting to hear stories of terrified villages besieged by black savages, they heard the opposite. The locals blamed the MPs. They described the MPs as aggressors, as bullies who had started a fight they could not finish. They spoke of the black soldiers as victims who had been pushed too far. This testimony was dangerous. It threatened to expose the rot at the core of the segregated army. So the army decided to do what institutions always do when the truth is inconvenient. They decided to bury it. The court-martial would go ahead, but it would be carefully managed. The focus would be narrow. The context would be stripped away. For the men of the 1511th, the weeks following the battle were a time of despair. They were confined to quarters, watched by armed guards. They mourned Private Crossland, whose body was quietly buried in a military cemetery, far from a family who would never be told the full truth of how he died. They waited for the gavel to fall. But amidst the fear, there was also a strange, grim pride. They had done it. For one night, they had refused to be boys. They had refused to be niggers. They had been soldiers. They had defended themselves against tyranny, even if that tyranny wore the same uniform. They had looked the Jim Crow army in the eye and made it blink. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was over. The shooting had stopped. But the second battle, the battle for the truth, was just beginning. And the U.S. Army was about to unleash a legal assault designed to ensure that the 1511th would be remembered not as victims of racism, but as criminals. The courtroom was ready. The verdict was practically written. But the story refused to stay in the dark. Because unlike in the American South, in England, there were witnesses who were not afraid to speak. And their voices were about to complicate everything. The court-martial of the Bamber Bridge mutineers began in the summer of 1943, and from the moment the gavel banged down, it was clear that this was not a search for justice. It was a search for scapegoats. The United States Army was embarrassed. They had allowed a race war to explode in the backyard of their most important ally. They needed to clean up the mess, and in the military logic of the time, cleaning up meant crushing the black soldiers who had dared to fight back. The trial took place at Paignton, in Devon, far away from the friendly witnesses of Bamber Bridge. This was a strategic move. The army prosecution knew that if the trial were held in Lancashire, the British locals might protest outside the courtroom. They might testify that the MPs were drunk bullies. By moving the venue, the army isolated the defendants, stripping them of the community support that had emboldened them in the first place. 32 men stood accused. They were charged with mutiny, seizing arms, rioting, and firing upon superior officers. The prosecutors painted a picture of lawless chaos. They described the men of the 1511th as an undisciplined mob, drunk on beer and rage, who had turned on the lawful authority of the military police without provocation. They presented the bullet-riddled MP jeeps as evidence of the black soldiers' savagery. They conveniently omitted the fact that the MPs had arrived with a machine gun and fired first into the barracks. The defense was hampered by the rigid hierarchy of the 1940s military. How do you defend a black private against the word of a white officer? In a system built on white supremacy, the testimony of a black man was inherently suspect. The defendants tried to explain the context. They tried to explain the months of harassment, the beatings, the color bar, the shooting of Private Adams. They argued self-defense. They argued that they genuinely believed they were going to be massacred if they did not fight back. But self-defense against a superior officer is not a concept the military likes to entertain. To the tribunal of white officers sitting in judgment, the motives did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the chain of command. If a black soldier points a rifle at a white MP, the soldier is wrong. Period. The context is irrelevant. The provocation is irrelevant. The racism is irrelevant. The verdicts were swift and brutal. Of the 32 men charged, 27 were convicted. They were not given slaps on the wrist. They were sentenced to hard labor. The sentences ranged from 3 months to 15 years. 15 years. Imagine that. You volunteer to serve your country in a world war. You are shipped to a foreign land. You are harassed and abused by your own police force. And when you defend yourself, You were locked in a military prison for a decade and a half. You were stripped of your pay, your rank, and your dignity. You were given a dishonorable discharge, a stain that will follow you for the rest of your life, denying you veterans' benefits, voting rights, and employment opportunities back home. But the army was not done. They did not just want to punish the men, they wanted to sanitize the record. They realized that the Battle of Bamber Bridge was a symptom of a much larger disease, a disease that threatened to rot the entire war effort. The tension between black troops and white MPs was boiling over everywhere. There were riots in Bristol, in Leicester, in Ipswich. The friendly invasion of Britain was turning into a civil war. So, the High Command did something interesting. They commissioned a report. General Ira Aker, the same man who had tried to segregate the pubs, ordered a review of what had happened. The resulting document is a masterclass in bureaucratic racism. It acknowledged, grudgingly, that the MPs at Bamber Bridge had been poorly led and overly aggressive. It admitted that racial slurs had been used. But then, it pivoted. The report concluded that the real problem was not white racism. It was black incompetence. It argued that black soldiers had low intelligence and lacked the discipline to handle the freedoms of England. It blamed the agitators within the black ranks for stirring up trouble. It was a classic case of victim blaming. The solution, according to the army, was not to punish the racist MPs. It was to tighten the leash on the black troops. The 1511th Quartermaster Regiment was effectively dismantled. The unit was purged of its troublemakers. The men who were not in prison were transferred to other units, scattered to the winds so that they could not organize again. The officers were reassigned. The name of the unit was tainted. And then, the silence descended. The U.S. Army classified the records of the mutiny. They locked them away in the archives, stamped secret. They did not want the American public to know that black soldiers were shooting back. They did not want the Germans to use it as propaganda. But mostly, they did not want to admit that the arsenal of democracy was practicing tyranny within its own ranks. For the men who went to prison, the war ended in a cell. They missed D-Day. They missed the liberation of Paris. While their white counterparts came home to ticker-tape parades and the GI Bill, the mutineers of Bamber Bridge came home to shame and silence. They returned to a country that did not know what they had done and did not care. They could not tell their stories. Who would believe them? Who would believe that they had fought a pitched battle against the U.S. Army in an English village? It sounded like a fever dream. So they kept quiet. They internalized the trauma. They lived their lives as second-class citizens, carrying the secret burden of their dishonorable service. But here is the cynical twist, the detail that reveals the absolute hypocrisy of the system. As the war in Europe ground on, as the casualties mounted in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, the army found itself running out of bodies. They needed men. They needed truck drivers to move the endless supplies of gasoline and ammunition to the front lines. Quietly, without fanfare, the army began to review the sentences of the Bamber Bridge mutineers. They did not do it out of mercy. They did not do it because they realized they were wrong. They did it because they needed the labor. Many of the men who had been sentenced to years in prison were released early, returned to duty, and sent back to work. Think about that. You are dangerous enough to be sentenced to 15 years for mutiny, but when the army needs a truck driver, suddenly you rehabilitated? It proved that the judicial system was just another tool of logistics. The black soldier was a resource to be used, abused, imprisoned, and recycled as the white officers saw fit. The Battle of Bamber Bridge disappeared from history. It was not in the schoolbooks. It was not in the movies. When people thought of black soldiers in World War II, they thought of the Tuskegee Airmen or the Red Ball Express, stories of service and sacrifice that fit the comfortable narrative of patriotism. The story of armed resistance, of black men saying no, was erased. It remained buried for 40 years. The people of Bamber Bridge grew old. The bullet holes in the bank wall weathered and faded, becoming just another texture in the brickwork. The generation that had opened its doors to the 1511th began to pass away. But memory is a stubborn thing. It can be suppressed, but it rarely dies completely. In the 1980s, a strange thing began to happen. A maintenance worker in the town, a man who had been a child during the war, noticed the pockmarks on the wall of the Ye Olde Hob Inn. He asked around. He heard whispers from the old-timers. Oh, that was the night the Yanks had a war with themselves. At the same time, across the ocean, historians were beginning to dig through the declassified archives of World War II. They found the court-martial records. They found the reports of General Acre. They pieced together the timeline. And slowly, like a ghost ship emerging from the fog, the truth of Bamber Bridge began to return to the surface. It was not a riot. It was not a shameful incident of indiscipline. It was a civil rights uprising. It was the precursor to Ferguson, to Watts, to Detroit. It was black men demanding the right to exist without harassment. But there was one final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle that remained hidden. What happened to the men? Not the ones who went to prison, but the ones who survived? What happened to the unit? And why, even today, is this battle virtually unknown in the United States, while in a small village in England, they still raise a glass to the memory of the tan Yanks who refused to bow down? As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we have to look at the legacy of that night. Because the bullets fired in Bamber Bridge did not just hit brick and flesh. They struck at the very heart of the lie America was telling itself about the war. They shattered the illusion of the greatest generation as a unified force of good. They revealed that for black Americans, the enemy was not just in Berlin or Tokyo. The enemy was in the mirror. And for the people of Bamber Bridge, the memory of that night became something else entirely, a badge of honor. They had not sided with the powerful. They had not sided with the police. They had sided with the oppressed. And in doing so, they had shown more American spirit than the American army itself. But the cover-up had done its work. The veterans were gone. Their names were lost. And the modern U.S. military, desperate to maintain its image, had no interest in revisiting the night its own soldiers turned their guns on each other. The silence had lasted for decades. But silence, eventually, gets loud. And when the full story finally broke, it forced a reckoning that is still happening today. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was over in 1943. But the war for its meaning, for who was right and who was wrong, was just getting started. The silence that followed the Battle of Bamber Bridge was heavier than the gunfire. In the weeks after the court-martial, the 1511th Quartermaster Regiment was dissolved in all but name. The men were scattered to the winds, transferred to different units, sent to different fronts, or locked away in military prisons. The United States Army was engaged in a massive, deliberate act of sanitization. They did not just want to punish the mutineers, they wanted to erase the memory of the mutiny itself. They understood that the story of black soldiers taking up arms against white MPs was a contagion. If it spread, if other units in the European theatre heard that the 1511th had fought back and survived, the entire structure of the segregated military might collapse from within. So, they buried it. The files were stamped secret. The official reports were filed away in the deepest, darkest corners of the Pentagon's archives. The narrative was carefully controlled. To the outside world, if the incident was mentioned at all, it was dismissed as a drunken brawl or a racial disturbance caused by a few bad apples. The systemic brutality of the MPs, the provocation, the murder of Private Adams, all of it was redacted. For the men who were convicted, the punishment did not end when they walked out of prison. Most of them received dishonorable discharges or blue discharges. In the civilian world, this piece of paper was a life sentence. It was a scarlet letter that followed them everywhere. A black veteran in 1945 America already faced insurmountable barriers to employment and housing. But a black veteran with bad paper? He was a pariah. These men were denied the GI Bill. Think about the magnitude of that theft. The GI Bill was the engine that built the American middle class. It provided low-interest mortgages, free college tuition, and business loans to millions of white veterans. It allowed a generation of men to buy homes in the suburbs and send their children to universities. But the mutineers of Bamber Bridge, and thousands of other black soldiers who were targeted by a racist military justice system, were locked out. They were denied the economic future they had fought for. They returned to the cotton fields, the factories, and the ghettos, stripped of the benefits that built the modern American dream. The army did not just steal their freedom, it stole their children's inheritance. And because of the shame, because of the fear, they stopped talking about it. How do you explain to your wife or your son that you fought a war against your own side? How do you tell a story that sounds so impossible? So the veterans of the 1511th took the secret to their graves. They died with the memories of the cobblestones and the traces locked inside them. But 3,000 miles away, in a small village in Lancashire, the memory refused to die. The United States Army could redact its files, but it could not redact the brickwork of Bamber Bridge. The bullet holes were still there. They marred the facade of the Ye Olde Hob Inn. They scarred the walls of the local bank. And for the people of the village, those pockmarks were not signs of shame. They were souvenirs of solidarity. For 40 years, while America forgot, Bamber Bridge remembered. In the local pubs, fathers told their sons about the Battle of Bamber Bridge. They did not tell it as a story of black criminals. They told it as a story of our Yanks. They remembered the names of the soldiers who had bought them drinks. They remembered the way the black troops had tipped their caps to the ladies. And they remembered the white MPs as the villains of the peace. There is a profound irony here. The country that these soldiers served, the United States, labeled them criminals. The country where they were essentially foreign occupiers, England, labelled them heroes. The British locals tended the grave of Private William Crossland. They put flowers on it. They treated him with the reverence due a fallen ally, even though his own government treated his death as an embarrassment. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that the truth began to claw its way back across the Atlantic. It started with curiosity. American historians, digging into the sociology of the war, began to stumble upon references to racial unrest in Lancashire. They found the court-martial transcripts. They found the interviews. And they realized that what had happened in Bamber Bridge was not a riot. It was an uprising. One of the key figures in this rediscovery was Ken Small, a British historian, not related to the Robert Smalls of our previous story, but a spirit kindred in his dedication to the truth. He and others began to interview the surviving locals. They found that the memory was still vivid. Old women who had been teenagers in 1943 could still point to the exact spot where they saw a black soldier diving for cover. They could still describe the sound of the machine gun. As the story emerged, it forced a reckoning. The narrative of the Greatest Generation is a powerful one in America. It paints World War II as a morally simple conflict, good vs. evil, freedom vs. tyranny. The Battle of Bamber Bridge complicates that narrative. It reveals that the good guys were enforcing a system of apartheid that was legally indistinguishable from the Nuremberg laws of the bad guys. It showed that the US Army was fighting for democracy abroad while violently suppressing it within its own ranks. In 2013, on the 70th anniversary of the battle, a commemoration was held in Bamber Bridge. It was a surreal moment. For the first time, representatives from the US military attended. They stood alongside British dignitaries and local historians. A plaque was unveiled. But even then, the language was careful. The official statement spoke of tensions and tragic events. They stopped short of a full apology. They stopped short of admitting that the military police had instigated a massacre. The institution was willing to acknowledge the history, but it was not quite ready to accept the blame. However, for the few surviving families of the 1511th who learned the truth, the revelation was earth-shattering. Imagine growing up believing your grandfather was a bad apple who got kicked out of the army, only to find out 70 years later that he was a revolutionary who had defended his life against a lynch mob in uniform. It rewrote their family history. It turned shame into pride. The rediscovery of Bamber Bridge also highlighted a disturbing pattern. It was not an isolated incident. Historians began to connect the dots. They looked at the riots in Townsville, Australia, where black troops were besieged by white officers. They looked at the Port Chicago disaster, where black sailors were court-martialed for refusing to load ammunition under unsafe conditions. They looked at the Argania race riot in Guam. Bamber Bridge was just the most kinetic, the most military of these events. It was the only one where the black troops effectively declared war and held their ground tactically. It stands as the supreme example of armed resistance within the military. Today, if you walk down the streets of Bamber Bridge, you can still find the holes. The town has not filled them in. They are preserved. And in the Ye Olde Hob Inn, if you buy a pint and ask the barman, he will tell you the story. He will tell you about the night the Americans fought the Americans, and how the people of Lancashire picked a side. But in America, the story is still largely unknown. It is not taught in West Point. It is not in the high school history books. It remains unwanted history. Why? Because it requires us to look at the uniform of the World War II soldier, that sacred symbol of American goodness, and admit that for one night in 1943, that uniform was worn by the oppressor. It challenges the myth. And myths are protected by silence. But the silence is breaking. As we move to the final chapter of this story, we have to ask ourselves, what do we owe the men of the 1511th? They CA not get their years back. They CA not get their GI Bill benefits back. Private Crossland CA not get his life back. But we can give them something else. We can give them the truth. We can strip away the label of mutineer and replace it with the label they deserve. We can recognize that their fight in the streets of England was just the opening salvo of the civil rights movement. They did not wait for Martin Luther King Jr. They did not wait for the cameras. They saw injustice, they saw a gun pointed at them, and they fired back. The war for the past is never really over. And as we look at the legacy of Bamber Bridge, we see that the battle lines drawn that night, between blind authority and the demand for dignity, are the same lines we are still walking today. The final question is not what happened that night. The final question is, why did it take us so long to listen? If you go to Ye Olde Hob Inn today, you can still see them. Up near the roofline, embedded in the ancient brickwork, are the pockmarks left by American bullets fired in the summer of 1943. The pub has been renovated, painted, and modernized, but the holes remain. The locals refused to fill them in. They kept them not as scars of shame, but as badges of honor. Those jagged divots in the masonry are the physical proof of a night when a small English village decided that right was right and wrong was wrong, regardless of what the most powerful army on earth had to say about it. But those holes represent something else, too. They represent the holes in our collective memory. For 80 years, the United States has tried to plaster over the story of Bamber Bridge. They tried to smooth it out, paint it over with the broad brush of the greatest generation, and pretend that the racial violence that defined the American home front somehow stopped at the water's edge. The story of the 1511th Quartermaster Regiment shatters that illusion. It forces us to confront a terrifying reality, that for black soldiers in World War II, the uniform was not a shield. It was a target. When they put on the khaki and the olive drab, they were not stepping into a brotherhood, they were stepping into a paradox. They were sworn to die for a country that would not let them live. They were handed rifles to fight tyranny in Europe, while being subjected to tyranny in their own barracks. The men who fought back that night, Private Nunn, Private Adams, and the rest, were not mutineers in the moral sense. They were resistance fighters. They were the first wave of a civil rights movement that had not yet found its voice. They did not have Martin Luther King Jr. to march for them. They did not have the Voting Rights Act. They did not have cameras to record the brutality of the police. All they had were their rifles and each other. And when the moment came, when the boot of the oppressor came down on their necks, they did not pray for deliverance. They locked and loaded. This is a dangerous history. It is dangerous because it validates armed resistance against unjust authority. It suggests that there is a breaking point where law and order becomes nothing more than control and suppression, and at that point, the only moral choice is to fight. That is why the army buried the files. That is why the textbooks are silent. A black man with a gun, fighting for his dignity against a white police officer, is an image that terrified the establishment in 1943, and let's be honest, it terrifies the establishment today. But the legacy of Bamber Bridge is also one of profound hope, found in the most unlikely of places. It lies in the reaction of the British people. The villagers of Bamber Bridge, the barmaids, the shopkeepers, the farmers, They looked at the segregated US Army and they rejected it. They did not need a seminar on diversity. They did not need a government mandate. They simply looked at the black soldiers and saw human beings. They saw their manners, their kindness, and their shared struggle against the hardships of war. And when the shooting started, they did not side with the white officers who spoke their language. They sided with the black truck drivers who shared their beer. This destroys the lie that racism is natural or inevitable. The racism of the US Army was not natural. It was manufactured. It was exported. It was a poison that the American command tried to inject into British society, and the British immune system rejected it. It proves that hate is something that must be taught, and solidarity is something that can be found across any divide. The mutiny at Bamber Bridge, along with other uprisings like it, eventually forced the hand of the United States government. The army realized that it could not fight a global war while fighting a race war within its own ranks. The cost of segregation was becoming too high, not in moral capital, which they did not care about, but in efficiency and discipline. The resistance of men like those in the 1511th made segregation unsustainable. They did not just fight for their lives, they fought for the future of the military. When President Truman desegregated the armed forces 5 years later, he signed the paper, but it was men like William Crossland, dying on a wet English street, who guided his hand. So, what do we owe them? We owe them the truth. We owe them the dignity of remembering their names, not as criminals, but as soldiers who were pushed too far. We need to strip the dishonorable stamps from their records, even if it is 80 years too late. We need to acknowledge that Private William Crossland was not a casualty of a riot. He was a casualty of American racism, killed by the very system he volunteered to serve. And we need to recognize that the Battle of Bamber Bridge is not over. The dynamic that caused it, the policing of black bodies, the presumption of guilt, the use of overwhelming force to demand submission, is a headline we see every single week in America. When we see a traffic stop turn deadly, when we see a protest turn into a riot, we are seeing the echoes of June 1943. The location changes, the uniforms change, but the conflict remains the same, the demand for dignity versus the demand for control. The men of the 1511th lost their battle. They went to prison. They lost their benefits. They were erased. But in the long arc of history, they won the war. They proved that you cannot treat men like animals and expect them to act like machines. They proved that the human spirit, when cornered, will bite back. As you watch this, somewhere in a quiet corner of England, an old man is probably telling his grandson about the night the Tan Yanks fought the MPs. He is pointing to the holes in the wall. He is keeping the flame alive. But here in America, the flame is flickering. It is up to us to pour fuel on it. We must be the new historians. We must be the ones to share this story. We must be the ones to say that patriotism is not just about saluting the flag. Sometimes, it is about shooting back when the people holding the flag betray the principles it stands for. The army wanted them to be silent. They wanted them to disappear into the fog of history. But we are here. We are watching. And we remember. If this story shocked you, if you believe that the men of the 1511th deserve to be honored as heroes and not criminals, then you have a job to do. The algorithm buries stories like this because they are controversial. Prove the algorithm wrong. Hit the like button. Share this video with someone who thinks they know World War II history. Leave a comment below saying "Remember Bamber Bridge." Let us force the world to see the history they tried to hide. They fought for their dignity in 1943. Today, we fight for their legacy. Subscribe to the channel, because we are going to keep digging up the truth, no matter how deep they buried it.